Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really unique perspective, a voice that connects the dots between farming, history, and literature. We're going to explore 3 different stories from California's Central Valley, and I think you'll find they uncover some surprising truths that really challenge what we think we know. So, let's get right into it. This quote from Victor Davis Hanson's grandfather, it just instantly drops you into a completely different world. I mean, just think about that for a second. Half of your farm, half of your entire property, wasn't for selling crops. It was just to grow food for the horses, the machines that worked the land. This idea really sets the stage perfectly for our first story.
All right, so our first story is all about the 2 things that have always defined the Central Valley: water and machines. It's a story of a constant grinding struggle and the incredible technological leaps that just completely changed everything about life and work there.
You see, the history of farming in the valley is, well, it's really the history of water. At first, it was all dry farming. You were completely at the mercy of the weather. Then came the irrigation ditches. And get this, water became so valuable that people would literally sneak out in the middle of the night to steal it from their neighbors. Then in the 50s, these massive dams changed the game entirely, creating huge reservoirs. And today, it's a whole new battle. It's all about efficiency, with high-tech drip systems pulling water from a water table that keeps dropping lower and lower.
Okay, let's circle back to that tractor, because this is where things get truly revolutionary. The switch from horses to tractors wasn't just a small upgrade. Think about it. On a 135-acre farm, 60 of those acres were just pasture and alfalfa to feed the horses. 60 acres! The tractor didn't just replace the animals, it freed up nearly half the farm. All that land could suddenly be used to grow cash crops, and that just fundamentally changed the entire economic equation to farming, forever.
And what's so interesting is that these machines, they weren't just anonymous pieces of equipment. No way. They basically became part of the family. They had names. They had personalities. You had Bluey, the little British Ford, Ollie, the old Italian Oliver tractor, and Big Boy, the massive, gas-guzzling Alice Chalmers. You know, these names, they tell a story all on their own. A story of reliance, and probably a lot of frustration, and maybe even a little affection.
Okay, so stick with me here. We're going to take that exact same idea, the difference between how something looks on paper versus how it works in the real world, and we're going to apply it to a totally different arena. We're moving from the farm to the battlefield, talking about the machines of war, tanks. First, you got to understand this one key concept. When a country like the US sells a weapons system, like an Abrams tank, to another country, it's usually an export model. Now, what that means is that it's intentionally designed to be a little less capable than the version their own army uses. Why? Well, it's all about keeping a technological advantage, even over your allies. So the big takeaway is, not all tanks that share a name are actually created equal.
So if you just look at the specs, the technological superiority of some machines seems absolutely unbeatable. During World War II, for example, the elite German tanks, like the Tiger, had this unbelievable kill ratio, sometimes as high as 7-to-1 against Russian tanks. I mean, you look at a number like that, and you'd think any battle was over before it even started. But as we're about to see, that just wasn't the whole story.
So here's the twist. What this quote tells us is that pure power and better specs on paper, that's not everything. The American M4 Sherman tank was totally outgunned by the German Tigers and Panthers, no question. But it had other advantages, advantages that, in the end, turned out to be way more important on the actual battlefield.
And this is where the real-world difference just slaps you in the face. Look at the numbers. The Germans built about 1,300 Tigers. The US, they built almost 50,000 Shermans. The Sherman was also incredibly reliable. It needed about 1 hour of maintenance for every 10 hours it ran. The Tiger was practically the opposite. And maybe most important of all, when a Sherman got knocked out, 3 out of the 5 crew members usually survived. It was a machine built not just to fight, but to be repaired, to be replaced, and to keep its crew alive. And that practicality, that endurance, that's what made all the difference.
All right, for our final story, we're shifting gears completely. We're moving away from machines and back to people. And we're going to look at a cultural story that has shaped how millions of people see the Central Valley, John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath.
Now, don't get me wrong, Steinbeck's novel is an absolute masterpiece. But its powerful story about the Joad family created a kind of simplified narrative. It gives you the impression that there was this one single experience of suffering for every migrant. But the reality for the people actually living it, well, it was a whole lot more complicated and way more socially divided.
I mean, even decades after the Dust Bowl, if you looked at a typical high school in the Central Valley, you'd see this incredibly complex social caste system. It wasn't just one group versus another. You had the established white farming families at the top. You had assimilated, multi-generational Hispanic families. You had recent immigrants from Mexico. And then, often at the very bottom of the social ladder, you have the Okies, the poor white migrants.
And yeah, that word Okie, it wasn't just a neutral term for someone from Oklahoma. It was a slur. It was used to mean white trash, and it was the cause of constant tension and fights. So in this really complex social mix, the very people that Steinbeck's novel focuses on were often the most discriminated against, not just by the wealthy landowners, but by other working-class groups too.
And here's another piece of reality that the novel doesn't really get into. The government wasn't always this simple savior. In the raisin business, a New Deal program created this bizarre kind of cartel. Farmers had to hand over their entire crop, 100% of it, but they only got paid for a small fraction that a committee called free tonnage. The rest of it, the reserve tonnage, was controlled by bureaucrats and packers who decided when to sell it and who got the profits. The system was meant to stabilize prices, but for the farmers who grew the crop, it often just felt like they had no control at all.
So, okay, we've got tractors, tanks, and one of the great American novels. What on earth is the connection here? What's the common thread that ties all of these very different stories together?
Well, it turns out every single one of these stories is about the gap between perception and reality. The best tank on paper isn't always the one that wins the war. A novel's powerful emotional truth can sometimes hide a more complicated social truth, and in every single case, it's personal, lived history, the stories from the ground that fills in all the messy, important details that the big, sweeping narratives always seem to leave out.
And really, that leaves us with one last thing to think about. When we go beyond the official reports, the technical manuals, and even the classic books, and we just listen to the stories of the people who were actually there, how does that change everything we thought we knew?